Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're prepping for the digital SAT, you know that one of the trickiest question types in the English section is the cross-text connection question. These questions often trip students up because they require you to draw connections between two different texts. It's not about understanding each passage individually but also synthesizing information across both. You might find yourself struggling with these questions like how do these two authors' perspectives differ on a given topic, or what evidence from text 1 supports a claim in text 2. I totally get it, and it can be super confusing, and that's where many students hit a roadblock. But don't worry, in today's video, I'm going to share with you a proven step-by-step strategy to tackle these questions with confidence. We will dive deep into understanding the common traps set by the test makers, how to effectively analyze both texts, and the best way to spot the connections they are looking for. By the end of this video, not only will you have a solid grasp of how to approach cross-text connection questions, but you'll also learn some insider tips and tricks to boost your accuracy and speed. And here's the kicker. Stick around until the end because I have a special reward just for you, an exclusive downloadable cheat sheet that summarizes all the strategies we'll cover today. It's designed to help you quickly review before the test and ace those questions with ease. Let's dive right in. So we already know that cross-text connection is all about two texts. So there are two texts given to you. So this time you are not reading just one text but two of them, right? So it's quite obvious that you will face the issue with time management. So any which ways, in a simple question of a digital SAT, you get one text, a question, and option elimination. But the challenge over here is that you just don't have one text, you have two texts which you have to read and comprehend, and then you also have to keep up with the time, right? You've got 1 minute 10 seconds to attempt this question type, and it remains the same. Now the key over here is what I generally suggest my students to do is that attempt this question type at the end. Right? So when you are taking up the test, you come across a cross-text connection question, mark it, and then come back to it once you're done with all the grammar questions and the easier questions of the reading section where you don't have to really critically think a lot or read a lot. This is something that you can try and see if that works for you. But of course, remember to come back to the question. Do not forget to come back to this question. Now let us go ahead and see the kind of question stems commonly seen in this question type. This is just to give you an understanding of how common question stems really look like in this question type. Let's see the first one. Based on the text, how would X, something mentioned in text 2, most likely respond to Y discussed in text 1? So this is about the response of someone in text 2 to something discussed in text 1. So again, here we understand that of course you need to have an understanding of both the text to really understand how would the text 2 person respond to something discussed in text 1. Let's see another question stem. Based on the text, both authors would most likely agree with which statement? So we know that the authors of the two texts are different, right? And they are probably talking about the same thing, but their opinions are probably different. So in this particular question stem, you basically have to identify what is it that the both authors would agree with. Now let's see the next question stem. Based on the text, what would X, that is in text 2, most likely say about the Y presented in the underlined portion of text 1? So again, it's similar to the first question stem that we read. It's just the only different part for this question stem is that something has been underlined in text 1, and how would the person in text 2 react to that underlined portion of text 1. Now let's see the last question stem over here. Which choice best describes the difference in how the author of text 1 and author of text 2 view X? So remember this question stem, it was about the similarity, what was common in between them, or what would they agree with. Now this question stem is about what would they disagree with, right? What is the difference between both of them? These are the common kinds of question stems that we have seen till now in this particular question type. Now let's go ahead and see the common relationships that you will find between the two texts that you read. So by now I'm sure you've understood that you have to understand the kind of relationships that both the texts share. So for that, we have listed a few common relationships that you'll find between the texts. Now they can agree with each other, as simple as that. So they're talking about A and their opinions about A is the same, right? The second number is that they disagree with each other. Now they're again talking about A, but the first one has some positive opinions maybe, and the author of text 2 really doesn't agree with that, right? So the text 2 author would probably disagree with that opinion or find something disadvantageous or wrong with the topic that's been discussed. The third one is that the text 1 and text 2 discuss different aspects of the same idea. So they are discussing the same idea, but they are talking about different features, right? So let's say the text 1 discusses a generalized view about A, right? And the text 2 is discussing the features of A. So they're discussing the same thing, but the different aspects of A. The fourth one, text 2 gives an example of an idea discussed in text 1. So an idea will be discussed in text 1 elaboratively, and the text 2 would just basically be giving an example of that idea. So again, it's simply about extending the discussion. The fifth one is about text 2 provides an explanation for a phenomenon discussed in text 1. Now again, text 1 is basically just putting this phenomenon in place, like introducing in the text 1, and text 2 is about the elaboration or the explanation of that phenomenon. So more elaborative explanation in text 2 and a simple introduction in text 1. This is how the two texts can share different relationships, and it's extremely important for you to identify that relationship correctly even before you start eliminating your options, right? But again, these are commonly seen. You can definitely find more than these relationships, but these 5 relationships are the most commonly seen relationship between the two texts. Now we'll go ahead and see the 5-step strategy approach for this particular type. The first step will always remain the same, that is, you will read the question stem. Now here you'll have to pay extra attention as to what is it that you're supposed to find. Are you supposed to find something that's similar between the two texts, or something that's different between the two texts, or about how the text 2 author would react to text 1? These are the things that you really have to understand very properly even before you start reading your text 1. Right? So once you've understood the question stem, you can move on to the next step, that is, you read the text 1. While you're reading the text 1, I want you to pay extra attention to the tone of the text. It's obvious that they're discussing something. Like, let's say they're discussing A in text 1. Is the text 1 positively seeing or viewing this A, or is it negative about it? This is what you need to identify. This is the tone that you're trying to identify. Is the author of text 1 positive about it, negative about it, or just neutral about it? What is the text 1 really doing when it comes to A, right? So in a way, you can say that there are 2 things that you need to identify when you read the text 1. You need to identify the overall idea of the text 1, what is it that they are talking about, and also the tone that they are keeping for that, right, for that topic. Now once you've understood the text 1, then move on to the text 2. Here again, you're going to read the text 2. You're going to identify the tone here, right, and what is it that they are talking about. So let's say we are going to identify 2 things, that is tone of the text and the main idea of the text, right? Now once you have done reading both the text, the 4th step and the most important step over here is that identify the relationship. By now you know what both the texts are talking about and what are their tones. Then you should have a better understanding of what is the relationship between the two texts. Are they agreeing with each other? Are they disagreeing with each other? Or is the text 2 a simple further explanation of something mentioned in text 1? Just try to identify the relationship, and then you can move on to the option elimination step. And we will be seeing all these 5 steps being implemented in the questions that we are going to take up in this particular video. So we'll start off with an easy level question and then move on to medium, and then lastly we'll take a hard difficulty level question. Knowing the 5 steps is one thing, and implementing those 5 steps is going to be different. So pay extra attention to the implementation bit. So here we have the first question on cross-text connection, and the difficulty level of this question is easy. So what was the step 1? The step 1 was to read the question stem and to understand what are we supposed to do while reading the text. So let us read the question stem now. Based on the text, How would Singh and Roy text 2? So these are the people mentioned in text 2. How would they most likely respond to the research discussed in text 1? So what do I know from the question stem alone? I know that there are two people, Singh and Roy, mentioned in text 2, and I know there's a research that's been talked about in text 1. What I need to do is I need to identify how would Singh and Roy react to that research that's been discussed in text 1. So when I go to the text 1 and I read it, I will pay extra attention to what is it that the research is about. And when I go to the text 2, I'm going to pay extra attention to how would Singh and Roy respond to that research, or what is it that their opinion is. These are the things that I'm going to pay extra attention to while reading the two texts that are mentioned. Now let us go ahead and read the text 1 first. Public policy researcher Anthony studied the history of elections in Australia. So we are talking about the history of elections in Australia, a country that requires citizens to vote. What is the meaning of requiring citizens to vote? It means that they were forced to vote, like all of them have to vote compulsorily, right? Fowler argues, this is basically Anthony, argues that requiring citizens to vote leads to a significant increase in voters who would otherwise not have the time or motivation to vote. So what this person is saying basically, that this rule of requiring the citizens to vote or making it a compulsion for them, what does it lead to? It leads to an increase in number of voters, right, who would otherwise not vote. So everybody is voting because, they have to vote. And before, if they did not have such a rule in place, they probably wouldn't vote. Thus, so now I'm going to be extra cautious because this is like the conclusion of the research, right? So when I read the text 2, I'll have to find out those two people, what do they think about this particular conclusion of the research? So I'm going to pay extra attention over here. Thus, election results in countries that require citizens to vote better reflect the preferences of the country as a whole. So what is the research really saying? It's saying that when the countries make it a compulsion for the voters to vote or require the citizens to vote, the country will know better what the preference of the country is as a whole, right? So it's better, when all the citizens are voting, we will know better as to what the country prefers as a whole, right? Their preferences are more clear when everybody is voting. This is what I understand from text 1. So in general, the tone is, let's say, positive over here. I did not find anything negative, correct? So they were very positive about this whole concept of requiring the citizens to vote, making it a compulsion for them. So that's the discussion in the text, requiring citizens to vote. And they are, positive about it. Now let's read the text 2. Governments in democratic countries function better when more people vote. Okay, so this is something positive about, requiring people to vote, because it says there's some positive aspect to, the understanding of more people voting. However, so be very cautious of these contradictors while reading any text. So something is going to change. Something contradictory is going to come up. However, forcing people to vote may have negative consequences. There you go. It's saying that when you force people to vote, you might find some negative consequences. Shane, okay, here we have those two people that were mentioned in the question stem. Singh and Roy studied. Now, this is where I have to pay extra attention as to what their opinion is, right? To understand the relationship between the two texts. So Singh and Roy studied what happens when a country requires its citizens to vote. So they're studying, when country makes it a compulsion for citizens to vote, what happens then? They found that when people feel forced to vote, they tend to spend less time looking for information about their choices when voting. So what did they find? They find that, people are not spending a lot of time in looking up for information about who they want to vote, right? They're not spending enough time because they don't want to vote. They're being forced to vote, right? As a result, votes from these voters may not reflect their actual preferences. So when people are forced to vote, their actual preferences are not going to reflect on the result of the voting. So ultimately, what's happening? Ultimately, the country will not know what the citizens really prefer, right? Now, the tone over here is negative about the research that's been discussed in text 1, right? The topic of discussion is always going to be the same in the text 1 and text 2. And the tone of text 2 is negative. They don't really agree with the text 1 opinion that, when everybody is voting, the country will know the actual preferences of the citizens. They don't agree. Text 2 doesn't agree with it. So if I have to look at the connection between the two texts, is basically positive and negative. They don't agree with each other, right? So before even looking at the options, I kind of already know that probably Singh and Roy will not agree with the research. They will not agree with the research and its conclusion, right? Now, with this understanding, we are going to look at our options and see how this understanding is going to help us eliminate our options. Also, remember, stick to the topic of discussion. We are talking about requiring citizens to vote in a country and its consequences, right? Now, let's look at A first. Only countries of a certain population size should implement mandatory voting. Now, remember the question stem said that how would Singh and Roy respond? So, whatever the Singh and Roy topic was, it was in text 2, and this is where my answer lies, correct? Did you find anywhere in text 2 Singh and Roy were discussing about the kind of population size should implement this mandatory voting? They did not mention anywhere in the text 2 that this is the ideal population size where a country can implement such a mandatory voting. They did not comment on anything like that. All they said was that you will not know what the voters' actual preferences are if you make it a compulsion, if you make voting a compulsion, right? So A is out because this was out of context. This was not even discussed by Singh and Roy, so I can't really comment on that. Now let's go to B. People who are forced to vote are likely to become politically engaged in other ways, such as these. Okay, I don't want to know the examples. I want to understand the main crux of this option. Now, option B says that Singh and Roy would react in a way where they're saying that people who are forced to vote will become more politically engaged, like they'll become politically engaged in some ways. But did Singh and Roy mention anything like that in the text too? In fact, if anything, Singh and Roy are saying that, people who are forced to vote, they will not be, making a sound decision. They will not be looking for information about their choices of voting. And they'll simply vote just for the sake of it, right? So you'll not know the actual preferences because they're simply voting without any information, without knowing who they are voting, correct? So if anything, it's a little negative, right? It's not positive towards being politically engaged. Right, so B is definitely out. Also, it's not even discussed about in the text too. So I'm going to say this is out of context and somewhat contradictory to what is mentioned in text 2. Let's look at C now. Requiring people to vote does not necessarily lead to election outcomes that better represent the preferences of the country as a whole. So this is what Singh and Roy would say, that when you're requiring people to vote or making it a mandatory task for them, it's not necessary that you will know the preferences of the country as a whole, right? It's not necessary that you will know this information because they are forced to vote. They are just voting for the sake of it. Correct? And this is exactly what we found when we read the text 1 and text 2, and this is exactly what the relationship is between text 1 and text 2. The Singh and Roy are not going to agree with this research conclusion. The conclusion was about the preferences, knowing the preferences of the country as a whole, and Singh and Roy, they totally disagree with that, right? So I like this option. This is matching up with what relationship I had identified between the two texts. Right? Now, let's go to D and see if we could eliminate it. Countries that require voting must also make the process of voting easier for their citizens. Singh and Roy do not talk about what the countries requiring voting should do about the process of voting. The process of voting is not discussed in the text. Spending less time looking for information about their choices is not the process of voting. Correct? So do not think that this is the process of voting. So D is definitely out because this process of voting is not even being discussed in text 2. So this is also out of context. So what were the reasons behind eliminating these options? There was out of context, something that was not even discussed, right? And then there was a contradictory, somewhat contradictory kind of an option where in choice B it said that the people were getting politically engaged, but as per the text 2 they were just making their choices, like for the sake of it. They were not even looking for the information. So this was kind of contradictory as well. And these are the most common reasons you will find while eliminating your options for this type: out of context and something that's contradictory. So very clearly I can say that C is the correct option over here, and I could eliminate A, B and D. With this understanding, let's go to the medium difficulty level question, where we are again going to implement this 5-step strategy approach that we learned about earlier. So now we move on to a medium difficulty level question. And again, the first step is read the question stem. So based on the text, F's team, text 1, and the author of text 2 would most likely agree with which statement about microbes. So what do I know from the question stem about the text? I know that in the text 1 there is a team that's been talked about, that's F's team, and the text 2 has an author, so of course it's written by somebody, so there's an author. And I need to identify what they both would agree with when it comes to microbes. So most probably the topic of discussion in text 1 and text 2 is going to be microbes. And I need to identify what would the both texts agree with, right? Now with this understanding, we are going to read the text 1. So microbes are tiny organisms in the soil, water and air all around us. So this is an introduction of microbes. They thrive even in very harsh conditions. So we know what they do. They can survive in very harsh conditions as well. That is why F and colleagues were surprised when soil samples they collected from an extremely cold, dry area in Antarctica didn't seem to contain any life. So this is a surprising fact, right? So in the previous sentence, they just mentioned that microbes can thrive in very harsh conditions. But when F and colleagues, they went to this particular place, which has extreme cold and dry area in Antarctica, they found soil samples and there was no life in soil samples, right? So this is a contradictory statement about microbes. The finding doesn't prove that there are no microbes in that area. So the finding doesn't really say that there were no microbes at all, but the team says that does suggest that the environment severely restricts microbe survival. So what was the result of the finding? The result of the finding was that it's not like there were no microbes in that area, but whatever they took, they didn't really, the soil didn't show that they could survive, the microbes could survive in that kind of an environment, right? This is what the finding is, and this is what the FN team is saying. Right? Now, when it comes to the tone of it, this is really factual kind of a statement or a factual kind of a text. There's no such negative or positive aspect to this whole microbes discussion. Right? As per their finding, they are not saying that they did not find microbes at all in that area, but that the microbes couldn't really survive in that environment. Right? Let's read the text too now. Microbes are found in virtually every environment on Earth. So again, the same thing, they are found everywhere. So it's unlikely they would be completely absent from F's team's study site. Now the author over here is saying that it's unlikely that there was no microbe at all in whatever the team, F's team, collected in their study site, no matter how extreme the environment is. So no matter how extreme the conditions were, the environment was, it's not possible that they did not find microbes at all. There were probably so few organisms in the samples that current technology couldn't detect them. So what is the author of text 2 saying? That there were very few organisms that the current technology was not able to detect those microbes in the soil. But since a spoonful of typical soil elsewhere might contain billions of microbes, the presence of so few in the Antarctic soil samples would show how challenging the conditions are. So generally, in a typical soil, you'll be able to find billions of microbes, right? But when it comes to the Antarctic soil, because they couldn't really survive, possibly there were very few of those microbes present. And why were they so few in number? Because of the harsh conditions in Antarctic. Right, now this is what the text 2 is saying. So the text 2 is also agreeing with the harsh conditions present in the Antarctic, right? And that, text 2 is simply saying that it's not like there were no microbes at all, but it's just that there were very few. And most of them were damaged because of the harsh conditions. So when it comes to the text 1 and text 2, the connection, what I found was that both of them are agreeing to the fact that, the conditions were harsh in Antarctic. in Antarctica, and possibly this is the reason why there were very few microbes available. Right now, with this understanding, let's go to the options, and here I want you to focus on as to how I'm eliminating the options. Let's look at A. Most microbes are better able to survive in environments with extremely dry conditions than in environments with harsh temperatures. Now, this option is simply about the comparison between extreme dry conditions and harsh temperatures. But we did not really find this kind of a comparison in any of the texts. None of the texts were comparing the extremely dry conditions and harsh temperatures. So A can be eliminated because none of the texts talked about it. Right? What was this? This was out of context. There was no mention of such a thing in any of the texts. For any option to be correct, the most basic thing for an agreeing kind of an option would be that it has to have a mention in both the texts, right? But in this case, in choice A, it was not mentioned anywhere, so A is definitely out. B, a much higher number of microbes would probably be found if another sample of soil were taken from the Antarctic study site. Now, text 2 did talk about a little bit about the soil sample, right? But choice B, but the text 2 never mentioned that if you take the soil from some other place, you will be able to find a lot of microbes, right? And more importantly, the text 1 did not even talk about it. It was just text 2 which kind of little bit hinted towards this, but the text 1 had no mention of such a context, right? So B can be eliminated because it was possibly a little bit talked about in text 2, but not at all in text 1. Let's go to C now. Microbes are likely difficult to detect in the soil at the Antarctic study site because they tend to be smaller than microbes found in typical soil elsewhere. They are difficult to detect, and this was mentioned in text 2, but there was no mention of such a difficulty in detecting in text 1, right? The text 1 did not talk about the difficulty in detecting the microbes in the soil at all. Because of the technology or whatsoever, the text 1 did not even have a mention about this. So C is also out because the text 1 really did not talk about this at all. Now D, most microbes are probably unable to withstand the oil conditions at the Antarctic study site. This is exactly what we identified after reading text 1 and text 2. That yes, the microbes were not able to survive the extreme conditions of Antarctica. Right? So this clearly is a correct option as per the understanding that we got while reading text 1 and text 2, and this is something that both the authors would agree with. So this is how you can eliminate your options when it comes to the agreeing statements, right? Alright, so now we are moving on to a hard difficulty level question. The step 1 remains the same, that is read the question stem. So let's read it. Based on the text, both psychs in text 1 and the scholars in text 2 would most likely agree with which statements. So what do I know about the text even before I start reading the text? I know that there's somebody mentioned as psychs in text 1 and there are scholars in text 2. And like the previous question, this question is also asking us to identify something that both of them will agree with, right? So when it comes to these questions where we have to identify both of them agreeing with a statement, we have to identify an option that is already been mentioned in some way in both the texts, right? So we cannot be focusing only on one text. We have to identify an option which is being talked about and agreed upon in both the texts. So let us go ahead and read the first text. In 1916, Sykes disputed claims that the Two Noble Kinsmen was co-authored by William Shakespeare and Fletcher. So this person, Sykes, finds a problem with saying that this book was written by William Shakespeare and Fletcher both. Now what he has to say, let's just understand it more by reading ahead. Sykes felt Fletcher's contributions to the play were obvious. So as per this person Sykes, Fletcher's contribution to the book or the play was very obvious, and if you know the use of a single dash, you know what comes up, right? So basically we have an extra explanation of why he thinks it was so obvious in the later part of this sentence. Let's read this. Fletcher had a distinct style in his other plays, so much so that the lines with that style were considered sufficient evidence of Fletcher's authorship. So because of Fletcher's writing style, it was quite obvious that Fletcher has been a part of this book, right? Let's read ahead. But for the lines not deemed to be by Fletcher, Sykes felt that the depiction of women indicated that their author was not Shakespeare but Philip. And when it comes to William Shakespeare being the author of the book, Sykes feels that he wasn't the part of the book, right? So the lines that Fletcher wrote in the book were very obviously written by him, and for the lines that were not written by Fletcher, because of the way of women were depicted, he feels that the book was written by Philip and not Shakespeare. This is what the text says. So the text basically in all says that as per Sykes, this particular book was written by Fletcher and this person Philip, and the text basically gives more explanation as to why he thinks that Shakespeare wasn't a part of it and in fact Philip was. Right? Let's read the text too now. Scholars have accepted the two noble kinsmen as co-authored by Shakespeare since the 1970s. Now, when it comes to the scholars, they have accepted the fact that Shakespeare has co-authored this book. Right? It appears in all major one-volume editions of Shakespeare's complete works. Why do they think that Shakespeare has co-authored this book? Because it appears in all major one-volume editions of Shakespeare's complete work. Right? This has already appeared in Shakespeare's complete works. Because of that, scholars feel that this book has been co-authored by Shakespeare. Though scholars disagree about who wrote what exactly, it is generally held that on the basis of style, Shakespeare wrote all of the first act and most of the last, while Fletcher authored most of the three middle acts. So based on the style that the book was written in, scholars have already framed an opinion. Because of the style, they know that Shakespeare has written some of the parts, wrote all of the first act and most of the last, and Fletcher had authored most of the three middle acts. This is what the scholars think. So all in all, when it comes to the relation between the two texts, they are in disagreement with certain opinions, right? So the text one author, or let's say Sykes, so as per Sykes, Shakespeare wasn't the author of this book, right? He didn't co-author the book. In fact, Philip co-authored the book. But when it comes to the scholars in text 2, Shakespeare was a part of the book. He did co-author the book, and of course, Fletcher is also a part of the book as per the scholars. Correct? Now, we are not supposed to identify what do they disagree with. What we're supposed to identify is that what is it that they both agree with. Right? So one thing, it's quite evident that they both think that Fletcher was definitely a part of the book. This is something that the scholars and Sykes, they both agree with, right? So with this understanding, we'll go ahead and start eliminating our options. We'll find your right answer. Let's go to A now. John Fletcher's writing has a unique, readily identifiable style. So, Fletcher's writing style is definitely been discussed in both the texts, right? And remember, when it comes to these questions where we are supposed to identify a statement that both the authors, like Sykes and scholars in this case, would agree with, we have to identify an option that is being talked about in both the texts, right? So A is definitely something that's been talked about in both the texts, but I can't really pick up this as my answer choice right away, right? I still want to go ahead and start eliminating my options to really be sure about A being my answer. Let's go to B now. The women characters in John Fletcher's plays are similar to the women characters in Philip Messenger's play. Okay, now remember, this women discussion was given only in text 1, right here. The depiction of women. That's only been given in text 1 and not in text 2. So text 1, yes. Text 2, no. And because of this reason, I'm going to eliminate B. So any option that I pick up, like I said, has to be a part of both the texts and not just one of the texts, because both of them, Sykes and scholars, have to agree with it, right? So because this women bit is not being talked about in text 2, I'm going to eliminate this option, right? I will not get into the meaning of the option and further detailing as to what is it that they are exactly saying, because it's not required. As soon as I see the mention of women, which is only a part of text 1, I can eliminate it straight up. Let's go to C now. The Two Noble Kinsmen belongs in one-volume compilations of Shakespeare's complete plays. Now remember, this mention of one-volume compilations, that's a part of text 2. So here text 1, no, and text 2, yes. And because of this reason, I'm going to eliminate this. What are we looking for? We are looking for this kind of an option. right? So here, because text one is not talking about the compilations and one volume compilations or whatever of Shakespeare, I'm going to eliminate it straight away. I don't want to get into the meaning and with the depth of this particular option. So C is out. D. Philip's style in the first and last acts of the Two Noble Kinsmen is an homage to Shakespeare's style. Now that the part where it talks about Philip writing the first and the last acts of Two Nobles Kinsmen, where is this being talked about? Now this is something that's this person Philip specifically comes only in text 1, right? This person Philip is not even being talked about in text 2. So what kind of an option do I have? Text 1 yes, text 2 no, right? So there you go. This is the reason why I'm going to eliminate this option here. So if you really understand its strategy, right, what did I do? I'm looking for an option that is being talked about in both the texts, right? So you can definitely very easily eliminate your options. So the strategy over here is to find an option that's been talked about in both the texts. This is the kind of an option that we are looking for, and that is in A. Rest of the options I've already shown how something has been talked about in text 1 and not in text 2 and vice versa. And there you have it, guys. With these strategies in your toolkit, tackling those cross-text connection questions on the digital SAT will no longer feel like a daunting task. Remember, it is all about understanding the relationship between the texts and using evidence wisely to back up your answers. But don't just stop here. To help you practice and master these techniques, I've created a special notes PDF that break down everything we covered today. The step-by-step approach, key tips, and even some practice questions. You can download it right now. The link is in the description below. It's a perfect way to reinforce what you have learned and get some extra practice in. But wait, there's more. If you want to stay on top of your game every single day, join my community. By joining, you'll get free access to our daily digital SAT English quiz, where I post new questions daily, introduce new vocabulary words that often show up on the SATs, and share tips to help you crush the English section. Trust me, you don't want to miss out on this. So download the notes and be sure to join the community. Let's conquer the SAT together.